Welcome once again to the Gaming News Canada show presented by B Gaming. I'm your host, Steve McAllister. If you're a journalist covering the business of sports betting and gaming in North America today, chances are you're doing so having been deprived of sleep, drinking far too much coffee to compensate for that, and also dealing with sore eyes and fingers from trying to keep track of everything happening from industry stakeholders, colleagues in the media, and from scrolling through the platform formerly known as Twitter. For a conversation on the news that matters most to the industry here in the Great White North, and there is a lot of it, and also across the border in the US of A, we welcome back to the podcast the senior news analyst for Covers, Geoff Zochodne. Hey, Geoff, we're recording this episode on the afternoon of Wednesday, April 15th, and until about 20 minutes ago, I was quite surprised to see you hadn't posted all day on X. That's pretty rare for you these days, is it not?
It is. There's usually not a shortage of stuff to tweet about. I try to be as economical as possible with my tweeting anyways. You know, you can spend all day on there firing stuff into the void. But no, today I did a bit of writing last night, so it's been catching up on some things, and I'm poised to tweet further in the afternoon.
Hey, Geoff, and I'll just mention to our listeners too, Geoff's a great follow on X. On a more serious note, if you're trying to keep track of what's going on in the gaming industry, and you are on X, it's at Geoff Zochodne is Geoff's handle, and it's definitely a must follow. Hey, Geoff, just for people that don't quite understand how journalists work and how a gambling journalist works, I think I've asked Jess Wellman this question on the podcast in the past, but maybe just give the readers some or listeners a quick insight into what your day's like these days.
Oh, geez. Well, it is frankly a lot of Twitter, because there's just a lot of news that's just happening in a lot of different places, and they all kind of percolate and bubble up to the surface in different ways. And so, there's stuff that I'm keeping a watch on through my own devices, whether it's making calls, emails, circling back on stuff with people. We're right in the thick of the legislative season, so there are a lot of bills that have been introduced, and they're all kind of on their own rails, progressing through legislatures or not progressing through legislatures, and there are hearings scheduled and debates being had, and you get various amounts of warning about when that's about to happen. Like we had this past week in Kentucky, there was a pretty sweeping gaming bill that was, it was vetoed, it was unvetoed, and it all happened in pretty short order. And so didn't get a ton of warning on that, but you just kind of know where that's coming from. We're getting a lot of news right now out of the courts. There are briefs being filed. There are decisions of varying degrees of seriousness being issued by judges. So you have to go in the US, you're on Pacer a lot, looking through the documents. And then you just have to have your ear to the ground on the news. There are a lot of other really good reporters who might be really focused on certain cases or bills, and they'll see something before you do, and you just have to tip your cap and say, okay, I need to keep an eye on that myself as well now. And then you can even go so far as to say, there are a lot of local news outlets that are on the ground in some of these states or provinces that are watching, that are in the legislatures, and gambling might not be their top priority for what they're trying to cover during the day, but when the gambling news happens, they're the first to see it. They're right there. We saw this. We've seen it a few times recently with Ohio, where we've seen some gambling restriction bills come forward, and the reporters on the ground there at the legislature were first to hear about it. So, and then once it makes its way to gambling Twitter, we're all over it from there too. So it's real, it's a bit of art, a bit of science, a bit of experience now at this point. I've been doing this for almost 5 years. So it's there's no perfect answer. There's just a lot of really good ones.
Yeah, it's funny too. It seems that 2026 so far is just, and I see this in the newsletter. I'm sure you're seeing this as well. There's just so much to write about every week. I mean, even it sat down Monday, and we brought Dave Briggs on board about a year ago, and Dave's done a lot of the heavy lifting on the newsletter. But I found lately I'm doing kind of going back to the the days when we started Gaming News Canada, where I'm doing more writing and a little bit more reporting than before. But Monday morning, we're kind of wondering what are we going to cover this week, and then by 1:00 yesterday afternoon, we got I think I was following up on some reporting that you and Tom Nightingale had done about Lotto Quebec entering the fray for the Supreme Court of Canada case, and on the second time reading through the website, figured out that the Attorney General of Alberta has now been given permission to be involved in that trial, and had a little bit of fun with the newsletter with the Michael Buffer reference. And it just seems like we're kind of back to those days where it's an embarrassment of riches in terms of what to cover. I would say Dave and I are in a little bit luckier place than you are, because we can often point to the coverage that you and Tom and Steve Ruddock and Dustin Gauker and the other really good journalists in the industry are doing. But still, it's been a really busy first quarter of 2026.
Yeah, and I think for you too, I think there are challenges for all of us in trying to decide what are the most important things to focus on here, because when you write about something, you want to give it the seriousness that it deserves, but there's so much out there that a lot of my process during the day is just thinking like, I only have X amount of hours here to focus on. What can I do here that is, most important to the readers, to people out there that they need to know about? And that can often just be a challenge in and of itself, because you sit down and start writing one thing, something else pops up and you're like, that's a pretty big deal. I might need to change lanes here, and it can happen without a lot of notice.
Well, even yesterday, I think it just felt to me like the Minnesota came out of nowhere, and all of a sudden, I think you had a series of tweets on Tuesday afternoon about what was going on in Minnesota. And Minnesota is one of those states where it just seems that once in a while there'd be a puff of smoke and there'll be all this news, I guess based on what's going on within the legislature there. But I think that's a good example of what you're talking about. Is your day was probably going one way yesterday, and then you had to take a detour because of what was happening in Minnesota.
And Minnesota is a state that I've actually spent an above average amount of time thinking about. I went down there last year for an Indian Gaming Association conference, and I got to actually spend some time going into town, talking to some people, went to the racetrack there and talked to some people there as well, just trying to get a feel for the state, which has had this like perpetual annual debate around legalizing sports betting. And they have got to a really interesting place where all of the gambling industry stakeholders seem to be aligned on a vision for it. The tribes there would have control, but there would be revenue dedicated for the horse racing industry. There would be tax offsets for the charitable gaming industry, which is really big there. You go into a bar in Minnesota, there are like these big tubs of pull tabs that you can buy while you have a beer. It's a whole thing. And so they have this framework kind of sketched out that they have a lot of people in support of. And it's really not getting the traction you would think in the legislature. And at the same time, Minnesota, like so many other states, now sees the rise of prediction markets, and state lawmakers there are saying we might need to do something. In fact, they feel like they need to do something this session, because if they just leave it unchecked for 1 year, that's another year of growth. That's another year of usage by people in the state. And so it's this interesting situation where the sports betting bill has kind of slowed down. It doesn't sound like people are very optimistic about it at this point. But there's also separate legislation aimed at restricting prediction markets in the state. And that seems to have a lot more support and got a lot more traction at the committee hearing we were watching yesterday. And we'll see where it ultimately ends up. But it looks like Minnesota is more inclined to restrict than to legalize this session.
Hey, Geoff, I just wonder, like, why, when I first started covering this industry, I think you and I both came along here at the same time. There was a lot of focus on Texas, California, and Florida in the U.S. because obviously they're big states, big populations. that would be big business for a lot of different stakeholders if those markets ever become regulated, sports betting and iGaming markets. Any insight into why that's been fairly quiet? Is it just politics, or is it because operators have bigger fish to fry, or what are your feelings on that?
I think politics is a big part of it. In Texas, for example, the legislature is only sitting in odd years, so it's relatively quiet right now. We actually got a bit of news about that where the lieutenant governor, not the lieutenant governor in Canadian parlance, the lieutenant governor, put out like some priorities that they want lawmakers to start thinking about for the session next year, and prediction markets were on that list, interestingly enough. But you only had this really short window in Texas to get anything done legislatively. And gambling, of course, is going to take a back seat to a lot of other more important priorities for lawmakers, understandably so. So that is just like a built-in obstacle for anything in Texas, no matter what. Then you also have in California, you had that costly ballot battle in 2022. And there's still a ton of scar tissue left over from that, because everyone's kind of in agreement that if you're going to legalize sports betting there, you're going to have to take it to the voters. And it's probably going to be at the, it's going to be on the tribes to really sort out what's going on there. And interestingly enough, we're starting to hear more from the tribes that they are working on a vision that they want to present to voters potentially in 2028. But again, that's a few years, that's not next year, it's the year after that it would go to them. And then you could talk about implementation after that. So still a bit off. And then in Florida, you have, a pretty protected operator in Hard Rock and the Seminole tribe, where that's been, stood up, tested in court. It can't really be budged at this point. I guess operators are free to try if they want to try with another ballot measure or something like that. I don't know. But it just seems like those three states, there are just these really, inherent obstacles that you have to overcome just to take it to the voters. And then the backdrop of that, as it is now the backdrop of sort of everything, are prediction markets, which are, you could really try to spend a lot of money and potentially make a lot of enemies and rub people the wrong way and trying to legalize sports betting in these states. Or you could just lean into prediction markets, and then you're in there anyways, using that federal regulation. And yeah, you're probably going to catch some flack from stakeholders in that state for doing so. But it's one of those situations where you think, is it better to, beg forgiveness than to ask permission? And then you're there anyways. And that's another thing that's happening, where that takes a little bit of the heat off of those national brands or in some of these pure play prediction market operators, because they can just do that anyways. And you don't have to worry about that state level, the state level obstacles. So I take your point that it definitely seems like the temperature has perhaps come down in those states. But the reasons why are, some of them have been there for a while and some of them are relatively new, and specifically prediction markets.
Yeah, I was going to mention earlier, the only people busier than journalists in the gambling industry right now are lawyers. With all the lawsuits, people. Hey, just quickly, Geoff, too. With all the talk around prediction markets, one story that just came out, I think, the last week or so, that has maybe been underplayed a little bit, is the Michigan Gaming Control Board sending 45 cease and desist letters to the legal operators, and that kind of came out of the blue. And I would say 6 months ago, that might have been a story that would have been getting more oxygen. And
then, the MGCB has been a bit of a trailblazer among gambling regulators in the U.S. in that it has shown itself very willing to send those cease and desist letters out to operators they feel are operating in an unlicensed or illegal fashion. And we've seen now, a bunch of these CNDs go out, as well as press releases announcing that they've gone out, because not only do they want the operators to stop, they want people in the state to know that they want them to stop, that they feel they are operating outside the bounds of Michigan law and regulation. And so I think that's, their MO. It's a very perhaps effective one for them because they're doing it in this fashion, and they keep doing it. And I think, yeah, you're right. Like maybe 2 years ago, these would be bigger deals than we think they are, but the focus is kind of shifting to other verticals, I guess you could call it, in the gambling industry they were thinking about. And, Michigan, they're locked in litigation as well over prediction markets. But, I think they feel that this is a very good tactic for them. And also, too, not every state gambling regulator has the same kind of leeway to pursue that kind of recourse against operators. It kind of varies. There are some that feel like they need to go to the attorney general and have them act instead, being the chief law enforcement officer in that state. So Michigan, the MGCB, they feel like that's the way to go for them. And yeah, it's a big, that they want to get as many names out there as they can to let the people in the state know that this is our list of people we feel are acting without our say so, at the very least.
I do wonder if it does get lost sometimes out there in the mainstream, just how omnipresent the black market is, and especially in North America. Again, like this is a pretty, from a regulatory standpoint, these are, the U.S. and Canada are still two fairly new markets. So the U.S. now was PASPA overruled 2018, so we're 8 years into that. Canada legalized single event sports betting back in the summer of 2021. And, we've mentioned it before. The Canadian Gaming Association did a study with Ipsos last year that still showed in provinces like Alberta and BC that the majority of gamblers were using, or not just gamblers, but people who like to gamble. There was a pretty large majority of those people still using what are considered to be black market or illegal sites. So again, that's why I think it's a way too easy to just say let's get rid of regulated gambling and that it's going to magically disappear.
Yeah, and funnily enough, like that is some more people are starting to actually take up that line of argument as well, and saying like we should maybe think about doing away with this altogether. Legalized and regulated gambling. And that just goes to the fact that we're just seeing more and more of these ugly headlines pop up, and people are just, they're frustrated. It rubs them the wrong way. And they see it as, a byproduct of legalization. And I think another interesting line of argument that's starting to pop up is the point that there is this pre-existing black or gray market, and legalization is intended to, wrap your arms around it and bring it into regulated channels. That's one that's being, tested a bit more now too, because when we see a state or a province legalize and regulate, and then the market keeps growing, the questions then grow like, did you capture, this pre-existing activity? Are you now cultivating more and more activity? And if that's the case, like how so? Why is that happening? And that's become the question. And so it is, I think, a very delicate time for everyone in the gambling industry, because there's just a lot of, there's a lot of pushback right now, and it's coming from a lot of different places over concerns about the integrity of sports, over problem gambling, over, household finances, the effects that might be had there. And I think, the industry, some of the talking points that have been used for a long time, it might be time to workshop them a bit, to try to procure more data. Of course, that has been something that with these nascent markets, we're getting some data. Perhaps time to dig more into it, to try to just show what exactly is going on there, the demographics, where this wagering is happening, who are the people that are wagering, that type of thing. But yeah, and I think it's a time to reflect, and I think that there's a lot of reflection going on.
Is your iGaming platform ready for Alberta? Bead Gaming is ready to support your new market entry with a SOC 2 compliant platform, multi-tenant infrastructure model, and unlimited configurability. Future-proof your iGaming performance today with a solid foundation for your next province. Bead Gaming is your partner for success. Get in touch at beadgaming.com. Steve Ruddock in his Straight to the Point newsletter, I thought, basically addressed that issue last week and talked about this as a bit of a come to Jesus moment for the regulated gambling industry. And I just want to read a section from the newsletter and again, Steve's a guy who's been around the industry a long time, and I think sometimes there's an unfair assumption that because people like us are covering the gambling industry that we're automatic advocates for the industry. I think that's not. I don't think that's fair, but anyway, it is what it is. But reading from Steve's piece, quote: "We need policies that aggravate everyone, from prohibitionists to professional bettors, and from anti-gambling lawmakers to licensed sports books. If one of these groups gets near everything it wants, you can be fairly certain that you have bad policy. Bottom line, no matter what you do in the regulated market, the black market will persist. It will offer unauthorized markets, credit betting, anonymity, looser KYC, and many more things the regulated market cannot offer. The answer isn't more of the same, it's clear differentiation. It's taking the high road, even if that means less GGR, less tax revenue, and more consumers placing wagers offshore." Your thoughts on that?
I think Steve is a very smart guy, and I respect his opinion a lot. I think he wrote a very thoughtful piece there, a very sober and sobering piece. For him to reach these conclusions, to put them out there, clearly put a lot of thought into it. And it's clear that he has a lot of thoughts too that he didn't put in the piece that he's also kind of thinking about. And perhaps we'll talk about it at a later date. And I think he makes some really good points. And I think when you see something like that, it's pretty reflective of the moment we're in, where there's a lot of stuff happening, and there are a lot of what can appear to be like knee-jerk reactions or just really poorly phrased defenses of the industry too. And I think for me, this is all part of the process, so to speak. When you legalize and regulate any form of gambling, the work doesn't stop when the launch happens, right? You are now the custodian of that activity. You have to listen to the concerns that are being voiced. You have to weigh them, and then you need to make tweaks accordingly that are in line with those concerns. You have a duty to listen to the public. And of course, you can hear out the industry as well and their concerns, but you're within your rights to pursue reforms if you want to. And this is all just part of it. And so I think in a lot of ways, the bigger, some of the bigger issues for me are prioritization by government in particular, lawmakers. If you want to do things, if you want to see changes, you have to make it a priority. You have to take the time to build up support for it, and then you have to find the time. I'm thinking a lot more in the States than perhaps in Canada, but you have to find your allies and try and push your agenda forward. And there's just so much going on that it's very easy for it to get knocked out of the way. But if it is a priority for you, you need to make it a priority. And in Canada, this has come up, with the advertising bill that's in Ottawa. It's a private members bill, so it's already kind of got that against it. It's not a government priority. Now that we have a majority government, they have tools if they wanted to pick that bill up and to kind of speed run it through Parliament if they so choose. And the question is that one of your priorities? Do you think that is good policy? And that's you have the tools to have that debate and then to take further action if you want to do so. So I think prioritization for lawmakers in particular is something that I think about a lot. I also think too, communication is just huge, because there are sometimes, I think, deficits in communicating to the public what exactly is going on, what exactly you've done, what exactly you want to see happen. Telling people what is and what isn't regulated. And being very clear about that, being very public about that, and then leaving kind of no room for conflation of regulated and unregulated, which has become a bit of an issue with prediction markets in particular in the US, where, there's offshore stuff happening. and onshore stuff happening, that the offshore stuff can't happen on the onshore, but it's still out there and people are still seeing it. And then they are, applying that to the regulated entities in the US, and it makes for a bit of a messy situation. So I just think when it comes to the regulation of gambling, that I think if you're a policymaker, you have to own it a little better. You have to say, we thought this was a good idea for all of these reasons. Now we have to defend it when we have these concerns brought up. And then if we are seeing things that are truly concerning to us, then to act on that and to communicate to the public that this is concern enough that we're going to go back and revisit it for these reasons. And so those, to me, like, this is just trying to like add a little bit onto what Steve was saying there. We're just like, I think those are just two pillars really to think about as well about all of this, because it's, he wrote a really great piece, and I think he flagged a lot of really valid concerns.
Yeah. And there is a link in it'll be last week's newsletter when the podcast comes out, Geoff, but we do link to Steve's piece. I'm really glad you mentioned communication, because, this is something that you and I have spoken about for 4+ years now. I think you and I were on a stage together at the SBC Summit Canada last year, and we talked about this at the end of a panel discussion. And I not only have I beaten a dead horse, but I've beaten a dead horse a second time and a third time when the horse is already dead. But there's just not enough voices from the industry here in Canada. And again, I give full marks to Paul Burns, but the president CEO of the Canadian Gaming Association, but Paul is way too often the only voice speaking to, not just mainstream media, Geoff, but people like you and I. Like Dr. Karen Schnarr's been the CEO of the AGCO now for, I think it'll be 3 years this summer, and we've been unsuccessful in having Karen come on the podcast, which to me is really disappointing, because I think the AGCO has done some great things. They get tons of praise for the work they've done around the industry. And there's also some really smart people at the AGCO, people like Brent McCurdy and Dave Phillips, and people who you and I run into at conferences and are very smart and knowledgeable about the industry. iGaming Ontario, it's been a struggle. We had Joseph Hilliard come on the podcast not too long after he was named president CEO last fall, but sometimes it'd be nice for those organizations, for them to be proactive into approaching people like you and I and wanting to have a conversation or wanting to talk about a topic for a podcast or an article, and that hasn't happened. The operators too often and other suppliers and other stakeholders, they lead the communication piece to Paul Burns and Amanda Brewer in the Canadian Gaming Association, which I think is a mistake. And the last one is the government. The government's done a lousy job telling the story about how they spend the tax revenue that comes in. And again, I'll separate OLG, because I think OLG does a good job. Obviously has big marketing budgets, but I think you and I, as people that live in Ontario, Geoff, we understand pretty clearly where the money that OLG raises, where it goes to. It goes to community centers and programs, and the places where OLG has a casino presence. That money gets steered back to the community. That story has been pretty clear, but we haven't read a whole lot about the tax revenue from the open market. We have had some big references about going to addiction programs, but I think the government would do itself and the industry a real solid by providing more information about what's being done with the tax dollars that are being generated from this industry that's now 4 years old.
Yeah, and I'll give Ontario some credit here, because I think the communications are improving and have improved a lot, from the launch way back when. Like for example, I was at the Next conference in New York about a month ago, and I think I was sitting watching the Canada panel, of course. You go to New York, you go to New York to learn about Canada. And so it was a really good panel. sitting behind me was Joseph Illy from IGO, and I just said to him, I was like, "Hey, can I grab you for a quick interview here?" And he said, "Sure." And so we talked about that. We talked about a few things, and he was very accessible. And I think they're there to talk, and I think that communication is critical. And I think it's getting it's gotten very good, and it's gotten much better, if you want to call it that. So I salute them there. I think the AGCO as well, they are getting more proactive. They're putting out, when they take some kind of enforcement action, they're communicating it very clearly. They're putting out the press release. They're willing to talk about that kind of stuff. I think where more the communication deficit lies is with government, as you point out, where it's they possess the why answer. Why has all of this happened? Why is this regulated system in place? Why do we authorize these operators? And from an industry perspective, you can speak out proactively if you want. I'm sure there might be some concern there that by sticking your head up and becoming a spokesperson, you become the kind of go-to for every sort of complaint that arises. You could, worry about that sort of thing. I'm just kind of trying to workshop it in my head there, or kind of game it out. So maybe that's it. But I think the communication is getting a lot better. It's more, the concerns right now feel like more existential than operational in some ways, where it's like you look around and you're seeing headlines about people betting on war, and you kind of feel like the world is just a very bad place, and you're like, why is this happening? And so I think when government and when lawmakers speak, they carry a different sort of authority than regulators can, because the regulators, their marching orders come from some extent from government, that from politicians. And so they can only say so much. They can only do so much. They can only communicate so much in some instances. And so I think it's on the policymaker side where I'd like to see some more improvement, just because when you pass something, when you enact a policy, I think it's, you're kind of beholden to defending it in some ways, right? Like you have to explain why you did this stuff. And I think in Alberta is a really good example of this, where I thought the provincial government did a pretty good job of proactively communicating why it wanted to do what it was doing. Minister Dale Nally gave a press conference. He's been doing media availabilities with local outlets, talking to them about it and trying to explain, using the argument, of course, that there is what they estimate to be a pretty significant black and gray market in the province, and trying to stamp it out or transition it into a regulated channel. And so, you can debate the size of the market or whatever, but you're going to get a pretty good idea of how much regulated activity is after the regulation happens. I don't think, when they report the first month of revenue figures for Alberta, whenever that happens, I don't think everyone who contributed to those numbers, it's going to be their first month ever gambling online. That's probably a bit naive. But I think Alberta's done a nice job, and just coming out, having the minister as a bit of a spokesperson there, and just kind of owning it, like owning the decision, I think is an important thing here.
Yeah, and Dan King, the interim CEO of the Alberta iGaming Corporation, he was, I think, our most popular podcast so far this year. It came on, I think, before the July 13th launch date was announced, and walked us through, how they were conducting business. And again, I just think the more information, the better. And again, I in fairness to the leadership teams at the AGCO and IGO, I mean, they, as you mentioned, Geoff, they kind of are acting on the marching orders of the provincial government, and there's certainly, with the Doug Ford government, there are some concerns around transparency and accountability. And I just think, bottom line, there are a lot of smart people working at those organizations, and I think having them able to speak about the industry is it just brings a lot of value and can shine a brighter light on the good things that are happening in a regulated industry.
And just one more point on all of this, we've seen some recent news about prediction market activity in Canada, and
Right.
people in Canada, we read the news in the US, we see what's going on there. That concern doesn't stop at the border always. And I think regulators in Canada, the securities regulators, the investment industry self-regulator, have been pretty proactive in saying, like, we're authorizing, if at all, a very limited, restricted version of prediction markets here. Like this,
Right.
This is not going to be, you're not going to see election betting. You're not going to see sports betting. I don't think they've actually used the term sports, but I think if you read between the lines of what they're doing, they're pretty clear there's not going to be any sports contracts. And I think that is a good approach because they're trying to get out in front of this thing before you start to have a bit of a panic.
Hey Geoff, just in Alberta again, we you've done some great reporting on the Alberta process. I would suggest anybody go back and read your coverage because you've spelled out the path and the journey to this July 13th launch date, and there's no reason right now to believe that's not going to happen. Just any high level thoughts on what you've seen with the model and any predictions on how you think things are going to shake out here?
I mean, what I'm seeing so far is, very Ontario-like, of course, the structure. There is more work being done on the front end, perhaps, than we saw with Ontario. They want to, of course, have centralized self-exclusion up and running from the jump. There is perhaps a little bit more transparency around the revenue sharing because, in Ontario, you have that nominal 20% revenue share for the province. Alberta, they are saying 20%, but after we deduct 3%, that is going to go toward, problem gambling and social responsibility initiatives, as well as the province's First Nations. And so, they're trying to be transparent as possible around what the revenue is going to go to. So I think that I guess the really interesting thing for me about the Alberta market is this pre-registration process. So you're having some of these operators like a Caesars or PointsBet or the ScoreBet that are signing up customers right now. They can't bet, they can't deposit, but they are now in the database, and the day that they go live, they'll be good to go. And I see that as really, as a lot of thought being put into leveling the playing field between the pre-existing gray market operators in the province and the ones that are coming in new. They're starting from scratch. They haven't actually taken a bet yet in Alberta, and giving these, I'll call them like greenfield entrants coming into the province, this opportunity to put themselves in a more competitive position right from the get-go. I think it's a bit different than what we saw from in Ontario. And I think this is a lesson that was learned there that, and probably some complaints that were heard, frankly, from operators, and really trying to create that much more level playing field. And then also too, setting that a pretty hard deadline for gray operators to make the move into the regulated market. So I think that is, maybe it's a bit more inside baseball than some of the other stuff that's going on. There's, if you want to look at it more broadly, there's going to be, I'm kind of perhaps like a little bit surprised by the interest we've seen already. It seems like all the big players are going to be there. I don't think anyone's going to be wanting, or at a shortage of operators in the province, anything like that. But I think that effort to ensure as much fairness as possible at launch is something that is just really worth noting.
Yeah, and I wonder if given that most of these operators, and not all of them, were in Ontario 4 years ago, I wonder if there might be a little bit more sophisticated strategy when it comes to marketing at the beginning, where I think it was just all these operators were just throwing dollars at sponsorship deals and advertising when the Ontario market opened back in back in 2022, and there were mistakes made. You've been on the podcast in the past. We've talked about it, but it does, and I think there was maybe a little bit of arrogance by operators, whether they're based in Europe or based in the US, where they could bring their same marketing strategy to Ontario. And I think there was a lot of backlash for that, and it didn't work. And we had Benji Cherniak was on the podcast last week, and Benji talked about the fact is that operators here are going to have to recognize that Alberta is a unique market, just like Ontario is a unique market, and they have to keep that in mind when they're spending those marketing and sponsorship dollars.
Yeah, I think there's definitely going to be some marketing lessons that were learned. I do think, though, in some ways, some of the Ontario relationships that were formed are actually going to pay some dividends for operators in Alberta. The one that really sticks in my mind is, of course, I'm still riding the Blue Jays high of last fall, and you're seeing, the Score has that partnership with the Blue Jays, and they're all over it, where like they're running ads behind home plate saying, "See you soon, Alberta," and it's like, for Canada's only MLB team, Alberta Blue Jays fans are going to see that and they're going to know. So I think that is something that's really interesting. I think more broadly, like across the industry, including in the US, the marketing partnerships are really being reevaluated by operators, whether you're getting enough bang for your buck, like whether it's enough to become just like an official sponsor, just to be able to say that type of thing. And even I believe there was some reporting recently about the NFL with their official sportsbook partners, like some renegotiating going on there, and operators not just like immediately signing up for another term. And that's really interesting too, because, it can cost a lot of money to do that. And in some ways, letting these costly marketing partnerships roll off your books and creating a more cost-effective strategy can be better for your bottom line. And so I think, it's not just the lessons that were learned in Ontario. It was the ones that were learned in other states across the US, that sort of thing, that are now just being, those lessons learned are being applied in Alberta. And so it will be interesting to see how they go after that. Like, are there going to be like a ton of sportsbook tents or sportsbook branded tents at Stampede, that kind of thing?
Right.
Alberta, of course, pretty big rural population, pretty big province too. It doesn't have the giant population center of the GTA that we have here. So how do you kind of make yourself known? And so there'll be some interesting, I think, tactics applied, and we'll just kind of have to wait and see. But there are going to have to be some made in Alberta efforts made, I think, as well too.
Yeah, and one issue that's fascinating me, Geoff, is just, as you just mentioned, what that presence is going to be around the Stampede this year, because the Alberta market launches one day after the close of the Stampede. So I'm sure we'll see a heavy on-site presence. The other issue I wanted to talk to you about was advertising, and in the Steve Ruddock piece that we mentioned earlier, Steve connected the dots between tobacco advertising and the gambling industry, and not just in the US, but here in Canada as well, tobacco ads are prohibited on television and radio. And I can't remember the bill's number now, but there was a bill years ago that basically eliminated tobacco sponsorship of which was a real heavy hit to cultural, sports, and entertainment events across the country. The Toronto Jazz Festival was an event where I think if it didn't fold, it came very close to folding. I was working at Tennis Canada a couple of times in the 1990s when Imperial Tobacco was sponsored both Canadian Open men's and women's tournaments and spending significant dollars. And it was those sponsorship dollars that allowed those two tournaments to be among the best run tournaments in the world, because of the money that was at Tennis Canada's disposal. And back then, my mindset, Geoff, was that if you were a regulated company, you should be able to do business just like any other sector. So if the federal government was taking in tax dollars for cigarettes and cigars, they should be able to do business the same way automobile manufacturers do, or fast food companies, or beer and alcohol companies. I probably have moved off that a little bit, but the advertising issue is really, really complicated. I mean, you talk about, I can't remember if you have children or not. I mean, I've got 3 children in their 30s now, and I know they aren't watching Hockey Night in Canada from start to finish. So they're not the people grousing about we see too many ads from this sports book or too many ads from that sports book, and I'm fed up with seeing gambling ads. But I also know, nieces and nephews who are teenagers and in their early 20s who I know are getting bombarded with gambling ads when they go on Instagram or TikTok. And we also, when you look at Alberta, we live in a country where we have I don't think it's overstating it to say we have a dying media industry right now, and especially local media, and those outlets would benefit from revenue from anywhere. So I don't think it's an easy issue to tackle, but I certainly get where Geoff, where Steve was coming from. Maybe, the idea of maybe you go down the same road as regulators or stakeholders did with tobacco advertising, and you take the same stance against gambling operators.
Yeah, when I was reading Steve's column and then getting ready to come on here, the one example, or perhaps like parallel, if you want to call it, that really stuck in my head was cannabis, recreational cannabis.
Yeah.
Because that was something that was very, relatively recently legalized in Canada.
Right.
And there were a lot of advertising restrictions put around it. And, now it's kind of just been woven into the fabric of Canadian life, right? Like the corner cannabis shop is kind of ubiquitous now. And if you want cannabis, you can go there. And, I haven't checked the numbers lately on how in a past life, I did write about the cannabis industry for a living. I don't do so much anymore. I'm sure the industry would love to become more prominent and more profitable, perhaps. So I don't know exactly how they're doing there, but that was an example of bringing in illicit activity into a regulated space and advertising it. And it came down to policy decisions. Again, this became the government it was then the Trudeau government. They wanted to do this, but they also didn't want to, throw in everyone's faces. So they settled on the model that we have right now, which I'm sure people in the industry might not love it. Maybe they love it. I'm not sure, but this is just the example I was thinking of. And when it comes to gambling, the same kind of thought about advertising wasn't really had up front in the single sports betting legalization debate. It wasn't really had. It was, if I remember right, this is like almost, I think, 4 years around now when we had the debate about single game sports betting. The concerns were, about gambling, about problem gambling, a lot too about First Nations participation and recognition of their gaming rights. Those were big debates, but they didn't have a huge advertising debate because they didn't exactly wrap their arms around what it was going to look like. And they didn't really understand, or they weren't aware of how it would be incorporated into a market like Ontario, which on a parallel track was preparing this iGaming market. And when you marry the two together, you have what you have today, and that is rubbing some people the wrong way. So I kind of get Steve's argument there. I think it really comes down to the policymakers to make the policy and to set it. You have that right, you have that privilege, you have those powers to go back and revisit if you want. It's there for you. There's a bill sitting in the House of Commons awaiting further passage if you want to do it. One that doesn't necessarily ban everything outright, but would require more study and thought about what kind of regulation of advertising there might need to be. But I think about, it's a really interesting thing to do. And I think in Canada, maybe we don't have as full-throated a debate about gambling as we have in some other jurisdictions. It's just not as hot a topic. And maybe it does need to be kind of put more onto the front burner and discussed because, it is clearly something that is weighing on people. I mean, to your point about, the tennis and other things, I remember going to the Molson Indy and seeing Marlboro cars fly by you, Marlboro branded cars fly by you. And then I think Paul Tracy drove one of them, the throw from West Hill, and then they eventually kind of went away. So gambling, like legal gambling in Canada, if you look at the history, it has always evolved along the lines of what Canadians believe is socially acceptable. It has kind of gone on that path where it started with very, Victorian era roots of gambling, absolutely not, to, okay, maybe a little bit of gambling, maybe a little bit more, it's fine, a little bit more of this. And then, the age of computers and internet came along, and it just made sense to lean into that as well. And so I think when you have that kind of history, it opens the door to, at any given moment, if lawmakers want to reconsider something and to try to harmonize, the regulation of the industry with what the public perception is, to try to address those concerns, to try to explain away those concerns if they can, they're free to do so. And I think when Steve writes a column like that, a really good one, that's an invite to anyone to pick up and pull on any of those threads, any public official to bring that up and to discuss, is this something we should be thinking more about? I think the most important thing is that you got to start with a conversation. Somebody's got to be talking about it. We're talking about it now. Maybe we're starting it. I don't know.
But yeah, I mean, in Australia, I think there's a push again to ban betting advertising during sporting events. I think there's a conversation you could have there that once you can have a sports interaction or a Bet365 or the score segment on the Hockey Night in Canada pregame show, and or Mike Johnson, the Mystic Mike segments on TSN, I think are actually good entertainment and they're fun. So I think there are some ways to present that information. I think the other thing that gets lost, and I love your thoughts on this, Geoff, too, is that there's such a focus on sports betting advertising, but again, as you and I both see with the numbers from iGo every month, 85% of revenue that the industry is taking in is from online casino or iGames. It's not from sports betting. So, I think sometimes there is a bit of a lack of understanding from the outside about this industry. And to me, that's a big one.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because it's a point that's been raised during the debate around the advertising bill in Parliament, people pointing out, maybe this should apply to iCasino as well as online sports betting. And I think there are probably a few reasons why we haven't gone to that point. One is that one of the few things people will still sit down and watch live, and that's important for them to see, are sports. They got to be there. You want to be there at 7:00 for first pitch, and you're going to watch it from beginning to end because it's important to you. And then, that is when a sports betting ad will come across you'll see it at that point. And it's, from a branding perspective, it makes more sense for them to advertise perhaps the sports betting side of things than it would for online casino during the game. Although I'm sure, there are some casino ads being run too, but it's just, and I think sports are in a very sacred place in that regard to a lot of people, where they're very important to a lot of people for a lot of really good reasons, including some very wholesome ones. In that, I'm a believer that team sports is very important because, you asked earlier if I had a kid. I have a 2-year-old right now, just signed him up for soccer. I believe it's important, sports, because, teaches you teamwork, teaches you how to get along with a bunch of different personalities, like learning how to deal with different people and just trying to figure out a way to it prepares you for life in some ways. And so I think that is why the sports betting side, for various reasons, gets a bit more traction. But yeah, and the casino side too, it's if we're going to have a conversation about iGaming in Canada, that of course means online sports betting and online casino. So they do belong in that same kind of debate. And I just want to go back to, your point too about the media industry in Canada, because that is an interested participant in further regulation and legalization, because it could be a potentially solid revenue stream for some of these entities.
Right.
And we kind of had a interesting situation in Ontario where the AGCO actually had to go back and put out a notice telling the media in Ontario to stop advertising unregulated operators in the province.
Right.
And so it just shows you that, again, goes to some of that communication deficit where, they're taking advertising dollars from people they may not really be fully aware of, their legal status in this country. And so it's all a fine, patchwork of regulation and stuff that we just need to talk more about. And I know. I think now that the federal Liberal government is in a majority position, they're in a position to prioritize things and to move it along more quickly, right? Not so worried about losing your, having to go to the polls every so often. So I'm curious to see if the advertising bill gets a bit more traction, or if it doesn't. And then if it doesn't, that would signal what the government's thoughts are perhaps about it.
Yeah, and just, a little bit, I'm a little bit invested in this, Geoff, and I just wonder if there aren't bigger fish to fry. And I look at that bill, and I look at, we just had the Future Sport Commission come out with a final report with a lot of recommendations to make big changes to the national sports system in this country, which to me is so long overdue. And full disclosure, I was hired by the former Minister of Sport, Kirsty Duncan, back in 2018 to work with her as a communications consultant, with a focus on that time at a bipartisan committee around youth concussions in sport. But I ended up being happily dragged into the file around safe sport and working with Kirsty and her advocacy work for a change in the national sports system. To me, that would be a better focus and a better placing of resources and trying to get through an advertising bill, which is going to be very complicated because, as the Canadian Gaming Association argues so often, the gaming in this country is conducted and managed by the provinces. You mentioned media companies involved. This is not going to be an easy path to putting a framework in place that actually has teeth to it. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's it's perhaps just one of several debates that should be happening with gaming policy in Canada. I mean, I am, you've talked about, you guys have tweeted about it this week. I know Tom Nightingale's been reporting on it as well. I've been doing some reporting on it. The Supreme Court of Canada has before it this iGaming liquidity reference that is containing some very interesting allegations, you want to call them, that are being thrown back and forth, and policies being advanced and that are very novel and haven't really been tested in a court. Well, they were tested, I guess, at the Ontario Court of Appeals, but and I feel like that case is, very significant and also just something you don't really see every day. And it's really flown under the radar, I think, on the mainstream, because it is talking about a very innovative type of structure for gaming in Canada, linking Ontario poker games with like Pennsylvania, that type of thing. And so we haven't really had a public policy debate about that type of thing. Maybe we can have it after we get further legal clarity on there, but there's that. I just think there are a lot of gambling issues that could probably stand with a little bit more discussion. I know Dave is very wired into the horse racing world, and they're going through some very tough times, not just in Canada, but in the US. And that is something that, it's one of the original legalized forms of gambling in Canada and has like a lot of economic consequences. How do we help there? Are we going to help there? What should happen on that? That's not really a discussion that's being had perhaps as loudly as it could. What's happening on the brick and mortar side? To the point about, it's kind of circling around it earlier, the discussion about the growth of wagering after legalization and regulation. You pointed out on the advertising side, so much of this is tied to online casino. Like when you look at the numbers in Ontario, it's online casino that's really driving a lot of it. Yeah. And so that then makes me wonder, where does that really growth come from? Is that all new wagering, or is that wagering that's coming over from the brick and mortar side, right? Is that just like an adaptation that users are, people who used to go to casinos in Ontario are going more online, and is that driving some of that iGaming growth? So I think like there are a lot of conversations that probably should be having that just aren't for various reasons, including the limited amount of bandwidth people have to talk about anything on a public policy level, and particularly with gambling.
Hey Geoff, that Supreme Court case, I don't think we have a timeline of when that case is actually going to start rolling. But I've had a couple of people suggest to me that given Ontario's 4 years old now, Alberta's going to launch in July, that Alberta might be the domino that starts the other dominoes to fall, and we're going to see other provinces come on board. Does this Supreme Court case, do you think a ruling in favor of the Attorney General of Ontario, and of course that's being backed by the Canadian Gaming Association, I think the owners of GG Poker, and also Flutter Entertainment, which owns FanDuel and Poker Stars, a favorable ruling for that side? Do you think that is something that might help knock over those dominoes?
It very well could, because once you start doing it and people start noticing it, that notice could expand beyond the people that are just gambling. So I think for sure that a conversation could be had, because I think too, the ruling has the potential to unlock forms of gambling that are perhaps, constrained or just can't be done yet. Like if you think about what the decision could do, for example, if they uphold the Court of Appeals ruling, you could not only have the potential of pooling poker and fantasy liquidity, but also like on the casino gambling side, like slot jackpots, for example, right? Like if everyone's wagering, if you have multiple jurisdictions wagering into like a slot jackpot pool, and that jackpot becomes massive in a way that it wasn't as massive before, does that become like a much more attractive vertical for operators in that way too? Like I think there are innovations that, I kind of shorthand refer to it as the DFS and poker case, but there are probably, there are other ways of looking at it that I'm sure the operators are looking at it as well, and kind of have ideas on deck depending on how this thing shakes out. And, it has to start with what the Supreme Court says. So we'll start there. But I think, to your point, that kind of high profile decision and perhaps the ramifications of it could stoke some more debate about, again, back to the why. Why is all this happening?
Hey Geoff, last topic, and we'll try to be brief here. We've mentioned a few times that Ontario is 4 years old now. There was reporting, including by Dave Briggs in last week's newsletter, about the departure of Casumo. I hope I have the name right. Their departure from the Ontario market at the end of the month. As Dave mentioned, I think we've had 6 operators leave the market since we launched in 2022. Still leaves us with, I think, 47 licensed operators. OLG making 48. Are you surprised? And again, I think you were with us, I think, in the early days where we used to do this show on Clubhouse or Twitter Spaces, and consolidation seemed to come up fairly frequently, and we really haven't had that. Are you surprised that the market has been as I don't know if tranquil is the right word, but it's been pretty stable, I guess.
It has been pretty stable, and it hasn't surprised me. I think you guys hit on a bit of a few of the reasons why I think that is the case, including the iCasino vertical that's available to operators, where they can, if you're happy with just making, a little bit of money, then perhaps that's good enough for you, just to continue operating in Ontario. So it doesn't surprise me that we haven't seen like a huge consolidation. But that being said, like I think these are just the signs of a mature marketplace that people come, people go, businesses open, businesses close. We still have people talking about wanting to enter Ontario. Like DAZN is one that's kind of kicked around the idea, which is like a really interesting potential operator to me because of the NFL rights they possess for broadcasting in Canada, right? Like they are an NFL streamer for a lot of people. And then if you have an online sportsbook brand associated with that, I'm kind of curious to see what they do, what their strategy is. So, I'm not surprised the Ontario market kind of has been been kind of relatively quiet with regards to consolidation. I think that's just a sign of operators being mostly happy with what's been done on the regulatory side. And I'm sure there are some who see that happiness and tranquility and are like, maybe that's a sign that maybe we were a bit too lenient here. And, that's why we're kind of starting to see some of these conversations about maybe we do need to tighten up on the advertising side and things like that, because there is a fair amount of money being made here. And so that, that tranquility might just be a bit of a calm before the storm, perhaps.
Well put. Hey, Geoff, before we let you go, I just want to mention that we're going to see each other at the SBC Summit Canada next month in the newsletter and the podcast post on Substack. There is registration information with a discount code for people who want to attend. You are going to be on at least one panel, I think, on day 2 of the conference on the 20th or 21st.
Yeah, I'm scheduled to be the closer.
Yeah,
I'm hoping to be.
Hopefully, you're more effective than Jeff Hoffman's being right now for the Blue Jays, right?
You took the joke.
Hopefully, you're the Louis Verlin. You're the Louis Verlin. Yeah, you're going to be on a panel. The topic is fragmented rules, hidden risks, tackling the gray market in Canada. Jeff, I mentioned last year, I was kind of half joking to the organizers, but I really wish I think it'd be great to put together a panel of journalists at the summit. I think, it would be really an unfiltered conversation. And again, just the work that you and Tom Nightingale and Mark Keith for casino.org, there are some people that are in the trenches covering this industry every day. And I think it'd be a fascinating conversation.
I agree. And I know when we do those panels, I try to provide as blunt a perspective as I possibly can, just because you don't get an opportunity to speak in front of so many influential people in the industry at one time. And so if you put a microphone in front of me in these settings, I will do my best to be as entertaining and perhaps provocative as possible. So that's my promise for SBC, is that I'm coming in with the goods.
We're going to make you live up to that. And on a personal note, that I always really enjoy the time that we get to spend together. We we don't get a chance to get together with the two of us and our other colleagues covering the industry. So I am looking forward to seeing you next month and hopefully having at least a coffee or a libation at some point over the 3 days.
Same to you. I absolutely love talking about the industry. I love speaking with you. Love doing the show. I'm assuming people already kind of gathered that I like to talk a bit about this stuff. So I think I might just leave it there at this point.
Let's do that. That is Geoff Zochodne, the senior news analyst for Covers. Geoff, always appreciate you coming on the podcast, sharing your insight with me. And as I mentioned earlier, you can follow Geoff on X, a great Twitter follow. Also, Geoff's colleague now, Ryan Butler, who covers the U.S. side for Covers, also really recommend following Ryan on X as well. But Geoff, thanks so much for doing this, and we'll see you in a few weeks.
Thank you so much.
That's it for this episode of the Gaming News Canada show presented by Beat Gaming. You can listen to my conversation with Geoff on the various podcast apps, and you can see our two smiling faces on the Gaming News Canada YouTube channel. Again, we're so grateful to everybody who subscribes to the newsletter and the podcast, for people who listen and watch this show. And for those of you that are subscribers and are going to be at the SBC Summit Canada next month, we do look forward to seeing you. Thanks as always, and we will see everybody again very soon.